Thank you, Professor JOMO. You delivered us a brilliant reflection about lessons from the pandemic COVID-19. And I'd like to introduce two special questions that if you can reflect with us, I'd like to appreciate. One question is about Brazil, of course. You told what happened here, specifically by Bolsonaro's government. One example that we have here, that our president stimulate the population to use no official treatment using some drugs that the science do not recognize as efficient in this pandemic. Second, it's about the one report that welcome Global Monitor have done 3 years ago in 2018 to show, for example, in Brazil, 23% are do not feel confident with science. And in the same way, they found the relation between the septic position and religion influence in the perspective. What's my question or my comment? If vaccination is a public health strategy that we need to cover most people as possible, the Brazilian president go day by day to the TV saying, I will not get vaccine in my body. I refuse to use mask. And they put, or he emphasized the religion in his speech. So the holistic approach, it's quite hard to do. It's important, but when we are facing and resistance comes from the government, as we are facing in Brazil, but I believe it's not only us, we have maybe other example too. When you are talking about lessons, what your reflection could help us in Brazil to think about the future, the present and the future. I know that most of us, oh, you are emphasizing Brazil, but I believe that we have a number of deaths that represent the barbarian that we live in Brazil. So, and we have comments and questions that maybe I can introduce. One, it's from Victor, and he put here one comment that just me. The audience, the participants say fantastic presentation, and Victor Karunan, I believe, he said, given that COVID-19 is today a global pandemic And given that our leader and nation states are unable and generally incompetent to control, manage, and mitigate it, should the authority and jurisdiction of managing and acting on this global pandemic be vested with an international body like the United Nations or World Health Organization, rather than left to member states? Is there a precedent for this? If the United States and the international community can take decisive action on the so-called global war against terrorism, why can't it be done for a global pandemic, which is the threat to all humanity? Which is the threat. And other participants, it's Kwame. She said, thank you so much, Professor JOMO, for putting very clear the last idea of building the world forward better and not back. This is a comment for her. I believe it is her, but sorry if I'm wrong. But she emphasized how important is in your presentation to think about forward better, not to back better, because the back, as you told, it's not good for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Lucia, for those comments, and thank you also for the comments from Kumba and the earlier one. I did not identify the speaker. Let me try to deal with Victor. Okay. First, the whole question of your president, Bolsonaro. I mean, he's you have to say, I think most people listening will agree that Bolsonaro is in a class by himself. You know, Trump is gone, and there are still a few people who believe in that, but most of them are going. Netanyahu is gone, and you look at what has happened in well, Poland and Hungary. The governments are still making their own arguments, but you know, I think it was the president of Botswana, I think, who died. Yeah, he was another one who would never want to take the vaccine, and so on and so forth. In the case of Bolsonaro, I think he was infected. He was infected. He survived, and this is an issue because, as you know, out of the people who are infected, more than 98% do not die. Okay, and people like him believe that, you know, therefore he is, you know, so this is part of the problem of superstitious thinking, and which is reinforced, unfortunately, by many religious beliefs in different parts of the world. Fortunately, there are also religious leaders who are taking the whole question very seriously, who are providing very good moral leadership in this crisis, and so on and so forth. But I don't think it's useful to generalize. Unfortunately, there are some religious sects which are worse than others, and they combine it with some kind of so-called religious science, you know, and it varies so much in different parts of the world. So I don't think we can generalize. So I find it very difficult to, I mean, which, you know, which president in the world will call for a coup against himself? But then when you realize why he was doing that, then you begin to understand it. But for most people in the world, when they look at the reports, everybody just looking at the reports, they don't understand why he is calling for a coup against himself, right? He goes in, he's having making a speech in front of the ministry of the defense ministry, or maybe it was the army ministry, when he called for a coup. This was, of course, many months ago, but I mean, it's unbelievable for others. It's almost like a bad comedy, like a bad satire, So when you try to explain to people, I took advantage of the fact that you are Brazilian and you understand what I'm talking about. When I try to explain to anybody else, they can't believe what is happening. They can't believe what is happening. So it's very difficult to convey this situation. But the problems you raise are very serious. But unfortunately, I don't really have any answer to them. I think to the credit, I think almost all the health ministers he appointed were forced to resign, or they were fired by him, because it just became too much, right? You agree to one thing, and then he asks you to say something else, and it became too much, and so there are a few people who still, like Anthony Fauci and so on and so forth, who still try to defend certain things and so on and so forth, and thankfully that is happening. But I, frankly, for an international audience, I don't know what to say about Brazil, what lessons which are relevant. All I can say is, I hope the elections come early and Lula comes back. I mean that is the most feasible scenario, but that's unfortunately is still a long time away, and many people are going to be sacrificed in the process. I know a few Brazilian professionals in the area of public health and so on, and they are very, very impressive. They are very, very knowledgeable. And Brazil, for example, one of my old jobs, we were thinking very much about how to improve nutrition. Fome Zero, or zero hunger, was also used to eventually to try to improve nutrition. So the whole question of hunger and nutrition was tied up. But unfortunately, those initiatives have largely gone for the time being. But I have faith in people that they will see through all this nonsense, and do the right thing. Victor's question, I'm sorry, I've forgotten what the question was. Let me deal with the third one first. Kumba's comment. I think this question which Kumba raised, by the way, this Kumba is a name which could be male's name or female name in Senegal, but in this case it happens to be a male, I think. Okay, there are also women with the same name. Okay, so there's no gender discrimination in terms of the use of the name. But in the case, what Kumba raises is extremely important, because if you're calling for a big fiscal effort, and we have already, let's not forget that the last 6 years, there has been very little progress towards say the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. Okay, even according to the official reports. In my view, the situation is actually worse because of the way poverty, for example, is systematically undercounted because of the emphasis on money. You know, that if you don't, the so-called dollar a day become, and the numbers for hunger, which I had to was also working with, the numbers for hunger depend on the way poverty was being defined. So all these numbers are interdependent, and so we do not have a very good view of the understanding of the situation. But I don't want to get into the methodological issues involved, but it is a very, very serious problem. But the question which Kumba emphasizes on building forward, what does building forward mean in our present situation? Now, this year happens to be the year of the Glasgow Climate Summit. Okay, so you have a Glasgow Climate Summit, and so let us say the rich countries agree to commit more money. Okay, right now all they want is a carbon tax. Okay, and if poor people are depending on greenhouse gas emitting fuels, just putting a carbon tax actually makes it much more difficult for them to enjoy an improved standard of living. That's why I do not believe that carbon tax is a very desirable approach. But let us say that there is money, and the money is very elusive, because I still remember before 2009, before the Copenhagen Climate Summit, there was talk about 100 billion a year by Sarkozy at that time, by Gordon Brown, and somebody else I can't remember now. None of that money materialized. And when money has materialized, it has been for mitigation rather than for adaptation. And for developing countries, adaptation is urgent, is pressing. So this is the big problem with all this talk. But let us say that the money becomes available. So how do we prioritize? And I would agree that in many countries, you need to prioritize renewable energies. And it is possible to reduce the cost. I mean, if we look at the price of photovoltaic solar panels and the unit cost of energy, it has come down, it came down up to the middle of the 1990s. Since then, it has not come down very much. But already at that time, it was competitive. It is competitive with fossil fuels. So, but to make that transition is not easy. And this is why it is so important to enable developing countries to make those transitions. So so we have to have a view of what building forward better would imply. And among that would be a question of renewable energy. And now, because everybody is aware about how inadequate health systems are, we should push very hard for major funding for universal health coverage, for universal health care, which is very, very far away. But there is a lot of expertise. There's expertise in Brazil, there's expertise in Thailand, for example. There's a dedicated university. And Thailand, part of the reason Thailand has done reasonably well during this situation is precisely because Thailand has the technocrats were able to push through certain reforms and to improve the health system, especially since the beginning of this century. And many of the activists from the 1970s were actually people who came from one university, particularly Mahidol University. And all this helped to improve the public care, even though the government's, the overall government might not have been especially progressive. So there are conditions which have been very helpful in certain situations. And we need to share that experience. We need to share that knowledge for people to realize that things are possible. as has been possible. And this is why I keep on emphasizing Kerala. There's a lot of misleading information about India, for example. People claim that the number of deaths in Uttar Pradesh is actually, they claim it is very low. In fact, what has happened in India is that the minister has been intimidating journalists, has been intimidating health personnel, so that they do not report the actual number of deaths. And this is a terrible situation. And this is why I backed off from some of us who were calling earlier for wartime mobilization to fight against COVID-19. So these are difficult choices, but I think it is up to the people in concrete situations to define the priorities which are most appropriate for themselves. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach to this. So thank you, Kumba, also for your comment.
Two more questions. Some questions from the audience in China. One, it's about tricks that pharmaceuticals can use. For example, evergreening patent. What could be possibilities for COVID-19 vaccines to be made patent-free? It's here. If you can check about the patent questions, and if you can give us more details about the Sputnik vaccine. And most of the news we read out its efficacy.
Okay.
If you have more information about the traditional medicines in this case.
Yes, I think it's very important for us. Let me try to quickly go through those questions. Victor raised the question about the multilateral organizations. Each multilateral organization, besides the United Nations itself, the other multilateral organizations such as the World Health Organization and FAO and the WHO and so on, they all have slightly different governance arrangements. In the case of the ILO, for example, the member states only have half the votes, and then another 1/4 are from trade unions, another 1/4 from employers. In the case of the FAO, it's different. And because of different struggles, I organized the second international conference on nutrition when I was in FAO working for Graziano. And during that period, it was very difficult because the governance arrangements of the FAO, they were not very concerned about the role of the private sector. But in the case of the WHO, there was a strict line. And so during the last election for the Director General, there was a big fight, because the big fight, there was one candidate who eventually got about 50 votes or so, who was being backed by the rich countries and a few of the other allies. And he would have tried to open things up. The other candidate, which was Tedros, who became the Director General, was the developing country candidate, and he was much more independent. Now, the guidelines in the WHO are also not foolproof. Okay, so the has a lot of influence. So, for example, go back to the COVAX arrangement, which I described earlier. The COVAX arrangement is often described as a WHO arrangement. The WHO agreed to it, but actually it was designed by Gavi. And the Gavi are controlled by people who are connected to, I won't say necessarily connected to Big Pharma, but a very important player, for example, is Gates. And for Bill Gates, intellectual property is very, very important. The essence of his empire is intellectual property. the essence of almost all the new billionaires, you know, about 70% or 80% of them are basically making their fortunes from technology, from patents. So for them, so even though they might be willing to give some money for various other so-called charitable causes, they are defending intellectual property in principle. So that's why Gates and other people keep on denying that that IP is part of the problem. Now, I think one of the questions from our Chinese, one of the Chinese viewers is precisely on this question. You know, does intellectual property matter? Does it make sense to talk about a patent-free vaccine? There was, you know, it has been very important, for example, for the polio vaccine and so on and so forth. But as far as the current crop of vaccines are concerned, a great deal of money was spent to develop these vaccines, and they all feel they deserve to make money, to get back some money. Some are more greedy than others. Okay, when you have a relatively small company like Moderna, they operate with different considerations than Pfizer, and so on. So you know, so it's very difficult to talk about all these companies as if they are the same. But all of them do defend the intellectual property rights. They defend that whole system, and they defend the rules, including the very the few concessions which have been made. Now, the question which has been raised is that why no sense of urgency? I think we have to recognize that after the end of the Cold War, okay, after the end of the Cold War, you have a situation where you had very strong dominance by one power, and that has come to an end. Okay, that has come to an end, so now we have the so-called new Cold War. So in this situation, so during that earlier period, with the end of the Cold War, there was a contestation between the sole superpower and multilateralism. Now, what we have is a situation where multilateralism has been weakened, very, very considerably weakened. Okay, and the only really the only assembly where multilateral power is really quite still of some significance is probably the General Assembly. Okay, so everywhere else in the Supreme, in the Security Council and so on, you have a concentration. Now, to me, when the Security Council took an interest in, say, climate, did it really change anything? I'm afraid not. It really didn't change very much. Okay, it was good that finally the question of security was broadened to include, other elements of human security and so on. But there was no fundamental change because you had a Security Council resolution. No fundamental change, I'm afraid. But the question is, do you give up completely on multilateralism, or do you try to claw it back? And to me, it is important to try to win back as much as possible of multilateralism. And the most important way of doing it, I feel, is actually by reviving the non-aligned movement. Okay? But the problem right now is that the BRICS doesn't really exist anymore. Brazil and India have gone different ways. So the BRICS, which could have provided the leadership or at least the core of new non-aligned movement is really not there. Is really not there. And so I think what we really need to think about is a new non-aligned movement where you have, for example, in Southeast Asia, a revival of the concept of zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality, and strict neutrality. You cannot have a defense agreement with some superpowers coming into Southeast Asia with their warships, with nuclear arms, and others not being allowed to do so. We have to do it very, very consistently and strictly. And unfortunately, it's not easy when you have many. So these are very, very contested situations. And likewise in Latin America, if there is a new wave now, if the election results in Peru, for example, and elsewhere result in a change of course in the southern cone of South America, maybe things will change there, but the signs are not very hopeful elsewhere. But one of the good things in Africa is that unlike say even a decade and a half ago, the African countries are beginning to get themselves organized. But what is sad and very disheartening for people like me is that the G77 is not working very well. The G77 has to become very, very much more assertive, and that kind of leadership, unfortunately, is not in existence. So there are people, of course, who will condemn everything which is happening in the multilateral system, and I can understand why they are frustrated, but I'm not sure it helps us very much to just throw them out just because we don't get what we want. We have to recognize that we are marginal. We are marginal. We are not in a situation. Somebody said it is like the tail trying to wag the dog. Sometimes I think we are the tick on the tail trying to wag the dog, and we don't have that much influence. The other question raised is about the patterns. As I said earlier, I think the pattern question is really not very relevant for vaccines, at least for COVID-19. Yeah, for COVID-19, it is not the key issue. The patterns are important for tests, important for personal protective equipment, the patterns are important for treatments and so on and so forth, but they are not important for vaccines. And unfortunately, however, there's nothing which we have. There's nothing which we have right now because none of the companies have signed on to CTAP. So without any countries volunteering to participate in CTAP, any companies volunteering to participate in CTAP, we can't go anywhere. So that's why I know some of my friends were very unhappy when I said you have to put pressure on the Biden administration to push not only to ensure that the Moderna can be scaled up at the international level, number one, and number two, to put pressure on Germany to force BioNTech to do the same. Now the other question is the related question is the issue of let me see of the efficacy of Sputnik. I don't want to get into an argument about that. I'm not a person who specializes in this. I do not have the technical competence, and regardless of what I say, nobody is going to take me very, very seriously. I just want to refer you to the fact that it was not me, it was the British Medical Journal who published the Sputnik phase 3 findings. Okay, phase 3 findings. And they found over 90% efficacy as far as Sputnik was concerned. Now, if you believe everything which people say, you know, you can believe anything you want to say, you know, and everybody has their own favorite story about something which happened after this vaccine and so on and so forth. And it doesn't help that, for example, the president of Alberto Fernandez, the president of Argentina, was infected after taking the vaccine. But this is bound to happen. You know, when you have only 90+% efficacy, what do you expect? Okay, somebody is going to get, some people are going to get affected. We have to recognize that this generation of so-called vaccines are not like smallpox vaccine. They're not like the earlier vaccines. And this is true across the board. So if people don't want to believe the British Medical Journal's peer-reviewed published article about the only company, the only vaccine which has gone through phase 3 trials, I can't do anything about it. Nothing I say is going to address those concerns. So yeah, so let me stop here. We can have a discussion about other issues.
Thank you, Professor. We have more 3 questions here on the chat, and we are close to the end of the section. So I will present the 3 questions. 2 of them is about the build forward better. One is, Professor JOMO, how can we build forward better if we are lacking domestic development funds? The government of Philippines is concentrated on stigmatization of democracy advocates and human rights defenders, red tagging as high-risk activists, terrorists, and communists. If we speak in public, we really need your thoughts and recommendations. Thank you. Support for my colleague from Philippines. Maybe we are facing close realities from Brazil and Philippines. The second is about many Asian countries. Civic space have shrunk, making the authoritarianism label. While I agree about your point about the anti-Asia bias, but how could we push the international cooperation grounded in humanity forward? And what are the next steps for us in Asia and the Global South to push the build forward better in the next half year? And finally, can we envisage any possible break on the power and control of Bill Gates Foundation and the big pharmaceutical companies? And wonderful, thank you, Sitsu. She said, we can go over time. We have a little more time. So please, Professor JOMO, you are completely involved the audience to present some important questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Lucia. Let me try to deal with the questions. Unfortunately, I can't even read the questions because of the lighting here. But let me first. There is a big problem that there's a so-called human rights approach. Okay, so there are a few people who basically accept the human rights approach and they fight for human rights. But we have to recognize that historically, human rights have been defined within a liberal political framework. Okay, so that's how it is primarily defined historically. In practice, especially since World War II, there are alternative ways of defining human rights. Let me emphasize, and I fully agree with that. But the basic framework of human rights has been liberal and has been individualistic rather than collective. And historically, what we have found is that it is political and civil rights which have been emphasized at the expense, I would say, of socioeconomic rights. And the so-called right to development is almost not recognized by most people. I mean, among us, we all talk about it, but nobody else, not beyond a small community. This is not something which is generally accepted. We have to recognize this. It doesn't mean we are against it. It doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to fight for it, but don't count on it. Then the next problem is that how do you translate a right to development into actual measures? What does it mean concretely? So I must confess that I don't go, when I want to talk about development, I start off with the well-being of the people and what it is needed to advance their well-being, rather than to start off with the human right to this and the human right to that, and so on and so forth. It's a difference of approach, but I can very well understand that in certain cultures, in certain political cultures, where the human rights discourse is much stronger and very strongly embedded, why people talk in those terms. Another danger, which I think we should also acknowledge right now, is the fact that when you talk about a rights-based discourse, we can talk about human rights. Unfortunately, there are also people who are talking about property rights. And property rights is the basis for patents. Okay? It is a basis for wealth accumulation. So we have to be very, very careful. So this becomes the problem when you are speaking, if, for example, in a debate or you have to keep on defining, explaining what you mean. You waste a lot of time. This is a big problem, that what we are talking about is human rights rather than property rights. And then what does that mean concretely? It becomes a problem. It becomes a problem. So my own approach, but I fully appreciate that in different cultures, different political cultures, people will emphasize different approaches. And if we are talking about, basically, particularly in relatively westernized political cultures, very often it is much easier. For example, in Latin America, there's, this is the main form. This is often a major form of discourse. But elsewhere, it may not be so influential. So again, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And the Philippines is a very special case. It's a Latin Asian country. It has a strong history of both Spanish and American colonialism. So it's a very, very, very unusual case. And I think it's important to recognize that there are multiple discourses and that we need to be able to communicate well with people in order for them to appreciate the need to support, for example, a call for universal healthcare or whatever else we are struggling for. Another question which has been raised is how do we advance international cooperation based on humanity? Honestly, that is very tough. In the present situation, where many people were expecting that after Trump, that the next administration would not continue the Cold War, what we have is actually adding the Russians to the Chinese. So it has become almost the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is at war with the US NATO Quad. So you have even Iran is almost certain to be in this, and this is why I think that for vast majority of developing countries, the best thing to do is not to align. There are very few countries who want to align anyway with China and Russia, or Iran for that matter. But the best thing to do in this situation is to have a new non-aligned movement, in my view. But we are still at very early stages. Nobody is really championing that, and I think we have to think very hard about what it would mean and how to mobilize. And let's face it, the G77 or the non-aligned movement is basically an intergovernmental movement. It's not a movement of the people. And we need to begin to think about how popular movements interact with government policies. And in many countries, we find that foreign policy is almost independent of, slightly more independent of domestic policy. So, we need to think about these kinds of issues. But I do believe very strongly that it is important for us to find a way forward where you're not drawn into either of those camps, into either camp. Okay. Yet another issue raised is, how do we avoid getting into the whole situation of led by the Gates Foundation and so on? This is a big problem particularly for NGOs. Many NGOs depend on funding. Some of them depend on foreign funding, and this is a big challenge for them. Again, the conditions are very, very different in many different situations, and I don't want to make any kind of universalistic claims, but I've seen, for example, in my own country, that there are many attempts by foreign governments to try to influence many of the opinion makers in our society, and the implications are very clear, but I don't think it is very useful for me to go around denouncing anybody for, so I don't really get into that kind of a discussion, but it might be necessary in certain conditions. But I do think it is necessary to point out the pitfalls of this approach, and to recognize that very often their claims are based on lies. They are based on lies. You see, the thing about Gates in particular, Gates personally, is that he honestly believes, I think, in technological solutions to every problem. Okay? Because he has no contact with society, no real contact with society. So for him, every problem has a technological fix. So I think he really believes that he has technological problems. So you have a problem, let us say, of hunger. The problem, so he has funded the African Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa. He has put in several billions into that. The results are very poor, but he probably thinks that he hasn't put in enough, or he doesn't mobilize enough, and so on and so forth. So now what are they doing? they are organizing a United Nations, so-called United Nations Food Systems Summit, you know, to push their agenda. And this is a summit which anybody who is involved in food problems, for example, is very, very wary of them. Many of their so-called solutions are actually creating new problems. Okay, let me give you an example. The solution for, so one of the problems is that it is argued that agriculture is creating a lot of greenhouse gases, and we must cut down the greenhouse gases. So one of the things is to stop plowing the land, to promote what is called no-till agriculture. But what does no-till agriculture mean? That farmers will become increasingly dependent on herbicides supplied by companies. Okay, which big agricultural companies, which will be selling these herbicides, and farmers will become dependent on them. So it is supposed to be a solution, but it's actually creating a new problem. And we know that some of these herbicides are actually carcinogenic, and all of them are toxic. All the herbicides are toxic, you know, some carcinogenic. So what we find is that a so-called technical solution is actually very problematic. But many of these things need to be discussed and exposed scientifically, you know, and how the money is, you know, the basic approach being used needs to be exposed, but it has to be done. It has to be done through systematic opposition. But right now, unfortunately, we do not have enough strength to offer an alternative. We do not have enough strength to offer an alternative in terms of a viable alternative to people who are trying to improve their conditions, and the only money available seems to be from Gates. You know, so this is the dilemma. There is all these new tech billionaires who are now increasingly dominating the world. They are becoming so-called philanthropists, and they are putting money to come up with so-called solutions, which are actually part of the problem. The COVAX problem was also related to this, because it came from Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccine Immunization, I think. Their approach was that, you know, for so-called neglected tropical diseases, okay, for neglected diseases, sorry. Many such diseases were not being researched, okay. So what happened was that I think Jimmy Carter had a foundation after he was no longer president. He funded research for guinea worm, and by funding that research, they overcame the guinea worm problem. So this inspired a whole approach of pre-paying. Okay, so regardless of the success of the research effort, these rich people basically prepay and fund research to find a solution to a particular neglected disease. And this became the basic principle in Gavi. Now they used the same principle for COVAX, except that COVAX, everybody was putting money. So there's no attraction of going to COVAX. You know, prepaying does not solve any problem. So the basic model, the basic approach was wrong. The Gavi problem did not the Gavi solution did not help help COVAX at all. So it was misconceived from the beginning, but these were people who were already receiving money from Gates and other billionaires who control the most influential think tanks in the West, especially on development issues, and their control has been extended. The development pages of sort of leftish English newspaper, The Guardian, are also sponsored by Gates now. So you find that it becomes increasingly difficult, and there are no alternate. And then the most influential syndicate now for articles is funded by George Soros, the Project Syndicate. And so it becomes so they are dominating the entire discourse. How many Brazilians, how many South Africans, how many Indians who are living in India, you know, or how many Chinese who are living in China actually get published by Project Syndicate? The only Chinese is one guy in California who has been predicting the end of Xi Jinping for the last few years. And before that, Hu Jintao as well. You know, I mean, these are people who have vested interest. The main Indian who has been published is a guy named Brahmachaleni, who has been trying to advocate war with China in different ways. You know, so these are very, very influential people. They are not only influencing the discourse in the West, they're influencing the discourse all over the world. Because unlike all the other syndicates, Project Syndicate actually translates into Portuguese, into Spanish, into many languages, especially in Eastern Europe. So they are very, very influential. And all the alternatives which emerged during the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s during the years of the new international economic order and so on, of G77, most of them have disappeared, or they are struggling to survive. So this is a big problem. So it's going to require a lot of effort on many different fronts, and there are many. It's not going to be easy. And I have to say, you know, that neither China or Russia or Iran are very good at soft power. You know, you compare it with how sophisticated the approach of Soros and Gates are, or many of the others in the West, and you contrast that, you know, with you know, so you can see there is a big lack of balance in this kind of thing. It is not as if the best ideas prevail. You know, China can give more vaccines than anybody else in the world, which is already happening. But, you know, you will still find a lot of anti-China sentiment because they control and influence the way many of the elites think. And whether you like it or not, it is the elites who influence the rest of the population. So this is unfortunately a major challenge. So I don't have, as you can imagine, I don't have any easy answers. But I think we have to recognize that this is going to be a long and arduous struggle, and we need, just like with COVID-19, we need a whole of society approach. But first, you have to persuade the whole of society, and that is not going to be easy.
Thank you. To finish this section, we have a last question. The question is, Professor JOMO has highlighted the problem of liberal discourse in thinking of the way forward. But since liberalism has been the dominant political philosophy for much of the history of the modern world, what alternative political concepts do you think are available today to face the liberalism discourse?
I think it's important to recognize that there are many liberal discourses, okay? And it's not one single liberal discourse. And very often when people use the terms loosely, you're getting a lot of things mixed up. Let me deal with the two issues slightly separately. The first issue about liberalism. If you think back about the middle of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, although he was very much a liberal, his view was actually very different from many of the original early 19th century English liberal thinkers. He actually saw a very important role for government and so on. Later on, I'm like an accordion, you know, this is a short history of liberalism. Later on, John Hobson, okay, John Hobson wrote a critique of imperialism, the first critique of imperialism from the liberal thing was developed by John Hobson. And when Lenin wrote his work on imperialism, he used Hobson, he used Hilferding, and he came up with his own views about imperialism. But the point I want to make is that the initial criticism of imperialism recognized, you know, that the economy in the late 19th century was no longer a competitive market economy. There was what Hobson referred to as concentration, which others might refer to as centralization. That had been taking place. It wasn't just the expansion of companies, but also companies coming together and forming oligopolies and monopolies. So he recognized this was changing, that the character of capitalism had changed. He no longer had the liberal capitalism of the early 19th century. And then in the 20th century, you had another liberal, John Maynard Keynes. I don't know why they all happen to be called John, but in any case, John Maynard Keynes came up with his views about from a liberal perspective. So, for example, he criticized, you know, his first important book, which very few people read nowadays, is called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. The peace, meaning what was agreed in Versailles after World War I, which was about 100 years ago. So he was saying that peace, which was basically saying, you know, Germany, you have lost, you're finished. You call me uncle. That was the approach of the Allies. And he predicted the rise of fascism as a response to the humiliation of Versailles. And then after that, of course, when in the 1930s, he recognized the problems of the Great Depression. He drew from the work of people like Michal Kalecki, a Polish economist who was in Oxford at that time, a statistician actually, and developed certain ideas. And these ideas were so fundamental to saving capitalism, but recognizing that capitalism had its own problems, that capitalism was creating its own problems. And so the point I'm trying to make is that this view about liberalism, that it means minimal government, is actually very misleading. Beginning from Mill, right through Hobson and through Keynes, we see that the liberal tradition moves in a very, very different way to recognize the transformation. But so this is why the so-called European liberals still believe in market liberalism, which doesn't exist in reality. And the American so-called liberals are, in fact, people who do believe in some state intervention. So the word now means different things, whether you're speaking in Europe or you're speaking in the US. And then now you have, in the last 3 or 4 decades, you have neoliberalism. And many people talk about neoliberalism as involving the extension of market relations. But that extension of market relations only exists in the minds of ideologues, of economists. It doesn't exist in reality. So what you have in reality is actually the strengthening of monopoly, the strengthening of monopoly and monopoly property rights, and very creative new forms of monopolies, new forms of rights, property rights of new types. There's a very good book by a German, Katharina Pistor, who has written about law and the economy. And she basically discusses how these ideas have actually changed so radically during that now there are new kinds of things, through property law as well as contract law. So Lazonic, for example, has analyzed how shareholder capitalism in the US has become very, very perverse. It's not even performing the functions for which shareholder capitalism was originally conceived. And you allow further concentration of power through the way shareholder capitalism is operating on. There was a Korean who co-authored a book with Lazonic about 1 year ago or 2 years ago, which discusses this in some detail. So the fact is that, in fact, that the rhetoric of liberalism is a rhetoric. In fact, the economic system is not a liberal economic system. As I've tried to argue, we have monopoly powers, which are very, very strong. We have oligopolistic powers. And the power and the ultimate form of it, with a new concentration of wealth, is with technology. Technology rights, property rights, patents, among other things. So we have to recognize that we cannot allow this liberal rhetoric to obscure our understanding of the changing nature of the economic system. And the system is changing at the world level, but how it affects different societies, of course, also is very different. So this is a very major challenge for us analytically to think about what is happening in the world. It's not easy, but I hope I have encouraged everybody to think about these difficult issues. Once again, let me thank the Global University of Sustainability and you, Maria Lucia, as well as Sui, for making this evening or morning, in the case of Maria Lucia, possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor JOMO. We have in your evening, in our morning, and maybe for most of other people, afternoon, and a special and powerful section that we are thinking about for your thoughts and it's a wonderful opportunity for all of us. Thank you for your presentation, Professor JOMO. Thank you for Kinchi, Lau, Professor Jad, and the forum to be invite us to stay here in this section. And we like to say thank you to the participants, because we received wonderful questions and to put all of us to think about the topic.